final part of this evening, we're going to have a chat about the future of drugs. And I've got four wonderful people to welcome up on the stage with me. And a couple of them you've seen already, but a couple of them will be new faces for today at least. We have got, you've just heard from her, Ester Kincova from Transform. We've got Jade Proudman from Cabbage. We've got Leonie Schnieder from PsyPan. And Elliot Rolfe from Mackrell Solicitors. Welcome, guys. Please come up. Doesn't matter where you sit. Oh, it's so nice to be joined by people on stage. Thank you so much for coming, guys. Really appreciate it. So I thought maybe if we just start off by talking very briefly each about who you are and a little bit about the organisation that you work for as well. Obviously, Elliot and Esther, I appreciate you've already gone into it in a bit detail. So I think once we've introduced ourselves, then if we could talk about how you got into this industry, because I think there probably will be some people in the audience who are thinking, you know, I'm doing something that maybe isn't kind of filling me with all the joy and purpose that, you know, I'm looking for. And maybe there are people who are looking for a career shift into something like what we all do. So I think the more we can talk about how we got to where we are now, the better. So let's just start with who we are, where we come from, all that jazz. Maybe if we start with you, Elliot, since you're on the end here.
I'll get it out. Thank you. Okay, super. Thanks, Max. Yeah, so we touched on earlier. I work for a firm called Mackrell Solicitors in London. We got into the CBD space originally in around 2017, 2018, and we realized very quickly that that was moving into the medical cannabis space, and the psychedelic medicine space was quickly leading on from there. I studied psychology and philosophy at university, and that made me, as you can imagine, quite interested in how the brain works and you know, our attitudes to things. I studied drugs from different perspectives. I even persuaded the uni to let me stick a 6-month forensic science module in there so I could study forensic drug chemistry for a little bit. And then we tried to look at, you know, why people use drugs in the psychology and how they work sort of neurochemically. Got into law, tried to work with some think tanks and policy institutes, and then sort of joined the conversation. And so then it was fantastic when I found that Mackrell had opened the UK's first dedicated cannabis law department, because then that was sort of a match made in heaven, and it allowed us to push forward with the psychedelic stuff.
And how big is the department? Are they looking for more lawyers to join the ranks?
Yeah, it's funny actually. It's very difficult to find people who have the blend of skills in both the scientific and the industry understanding and legal, and sort of bring it all together, and an appreciation of mental health and the sensitivities. You know, it's not something you can sort of just plow and commercialize like you can in some other fields. You know, there's sort of a pace of doing it. Yeah, so the team varies in size depending on workload and sort of movements. And at the moment, we've got a dedicated cannabis team and a dedicated psychedelics team that sit separately.
So if someone's at law now and they're thinking, okay, I'd actually like to get into what you're doing, what kind of path would you recommend that they go down to get those different skills that you talk about?
That's a really good question. So at the moment, you've got two sort of sides. We talked a lot about the drug policy side, and that's administrative law a lot of the time. And then you've got the medicines approval side, and that's regulatory. And what sews it all together is commercial law. So in one of those sort of three strands, we see a lot more of the sort of commercial activity in the psychedelic wellness space, where you've got people trying to connect the legal jurisdictions with the more restricted ones. But yeah, I'd say just get any exposure you can to regulatory, commercial, and administrative change.
Great, thanks very much, Elliot. Leonie, we'd love to hear from you.
Hi, thanks, Mags. Good evening, everybody. So the last stretch, I'm delighted to be here with you. I'd like to introduce myself, Leonie Schneider, and my colleague Ian Roulier in the audience this evening. Together, we co-founded an organization called the Psychedelic Participants Advocacy Network. And this organization, this partnership and organization got formed after Ian and I both participated in 2 separate clinical trials each. And what we hope to do through PsyPan is to pull together the collective voice of all the participants that are going through the clinical trial process and create a kind of feedback loop so we can feed back into the organizations running these trials, designing these treatments on what actually really works for the participant. Because I think it's you can actually get lost in the science and forget about the people that you're trying to help at the heart of the actual process. And yeah, that's where we're at.
And what was your how connected to the world of psychedelics and the science side, but also maybe the non-science side as well, were you before joining that first psilocybin trial at Imperial?
I've had a long-term interest in psychedelics. I had dabbled with them prior to doing the Imperial trial. And thankfully that trial was, it was not you didn't need to be psychedelically naive to participate in the trial. And I had noticed that they had a really positive effect on me. I'd been put on antidepressants or diagnosed as depressed in 1996 and kind of stayed on the antidepressants for 22 years and weaned off 2 weeks ahead of the trial to go on the trial. The experience was profound, possibly slightly muted if you compare my story to other participants that have been through the process. And I put some of that down to the fact that I'd been on antidepressants for so long. I have been off them since the end of 2019. Thank you. Thank you. It is an achievement. It's been a wild ride. And kudos to the poor husband who was trying to contain the pendulum swing from left to right. I fairly recently then did the small pharma DMT trial, not ever having had DMT, and yeah, I'm still trying to find the words on that one, right?
I think we should hear a bit more about that in a bit. Thank you so much, Leonie. Should we go, Jade? Let's go with you. You're down the end. Love the dress, by the way. It's fabulous.
Cheers, Chuck. I'm Jade. I founded Savage Cabbage in 2016. I was one of the first CBD companies in the country. The reason I set it up was not for business purposes. I'd actually had my own profound experience and having struggled with significant ill health, being in intensive care and saying my goodbyes to my family. I was left in a situation whereby my husband became my full-time carer. He was dressing me, bathing me, cutting up my food, and sorry, Ashwin, and struggling to function independently. I'd stopped living and was just existing, and I actually asked him to help me commit suicide. Okay, hello. Yeah, okay. I'd actually asked my husband to help me commit suicide. I didn't want to be here anymore. I asked him to over dispense the medications that I was prescribed, and he refused. And he made me watch a documentary called Weed by Dr. Sanjay Gupta, which introduced the Stanley Brothers and Charlotte's Web. And one night, whilst I was enjoying the morphine, I decided to send a tweet out to the universe and Joel Stanley. And he responded and said, "How can I help you? I'll send you a care package." I received it a week later. And within 48 hours, I was morphine free and had my first conversation with my children in 2 years that made sense. So I decided to, armed with a duvet, a sausage dog and a laptop, I decided to start speaking to people on the internet about my experience, because really realizing that the week prior you were preparing to depart this mortal coil and you'd got that to that point, you then completely consumed with this euphoria of I need to share this story. And within 2 weeks, I had to set up a business so I could import products from Charlotte's Web. I was on the brink of bankruptcy because I'd lost my job through ill health. I borrowed £500 off my dad. I set this up at the kitchen table, and we now service a community of 9,000 individuals in 44 countries. And it's a people first business. I could have sold out to the big guys many years ago, and I've chosen not to. People are important to me, and I think that if we come together as a community, So we need to set Mother Nature free, really, and we all need to benefit from that. Sorry, went off on a tangent.
No, it's amazing. Thank you. Thank you, Jade. And I mean, it goes without saying, but obviously you hadn't planned perhaps to end up in this industry.
Oh,
No.
sorry, no, not at all. I mean, I was a social worker for many years. I've always had in drug policy. Sorry, I'm having a real issue here. And you know, having grown up in quite a deprived area, many friends of mine have gone through heroin addiction. And then working as a social worker with families in real dire circumstances and seeing people being criminalised when actually all they need is love, support and care. So I'm still kind of, I guess, a social worker, but just in a different, you know, industry. But I mean, I tick all the lovely boxes of, you know, didn't really get much of an education, teenage mum. I put myself through college. I worked whilst having 3 children under 10. I'm not sure how I did it, but I ended up with a master's degree in education and social pedagogy. And I'm determined to help people and build communities.
Thank you so much. Tell us a bit about you.
Amazing. I've been asked this a lot, and I didn't have some sort of like Damascene drug policy moment at 12 and thought this is where I'm going to be. But I have always been interested in the health of communities, where I think like when I was 15, I started campaigning. It was just when David Cameron decided to do a lot of cuts. And I started campaigning to not close the youth clubs in South Oxfordshire. And I think that's kind of where I realized that this is what I thought was really important to me, was just kind of like identifying things that are good for society and making sure that they happen. I then went and did history at uni, so that's really not very relevant. But then when I came out of it, I worked in a community business funder, which was really focused on giving money to some of the more forgotten, low socioeconomic communities in the UK, and supporting community businesses so that they enrich communities instead of taking what they make out of them. And I think then when the job at Transform came up, it just made so much sense to be part of that movement. I think also, I mean, I was at uni, so drug use was all around me. And I actually, at the opposite of the Damascene conversion, I had my boyfriend at the time almost died from some bad pills. And I went totally the opposite way and thought that we should double ban them. I mean, I don't know what I thought, but I suddenly just feared for the lives of all of my loved ones. So I've come a complete 180 on understanding what reform really means and actually what legal regulation would lead to. Yeah, so that's me.
So at university, I'm not, forgive me, I'm not sure how long ago we're talking, but how much interest was there, from what you remember, around drug policy, around psychedelics? Do you remember there being much of a community?
No, none. It was about 10 years ago. No, I think it was just kind of hedonistic drug use and clubbing, but there wasn't an interaction with what was behind that beyond sort of getting into the car with a dealer and thinking it's a little bit sketchy. I think that actually we never really got that far. And I think the first time that I really did come across it was when I was doing my master's and I was at dinner with friends talking about cannabis regulation specifically. And even then I was still sort of on the edge of, well, won't that increase use? But it kind of started my conversation with myself about what drug policy really should look like.
So now, 10 years on, are you approached by university students, graduates for work at Transform?
Yes.
Yeah. So you've seen a shift, have you?
Yes, definitely. And I think that's really, really great. And I think it's a testimony to organizations such as Students for Sensible Drug Policy, which have chapters in universities all across the world and several in the UK that do some excellent work around drug use at universities. I think also actually the other thing was that we weren't going to be having a discussion about reform when my university at the time was so tough, had such a hard line on anyone being caught with drug use that you had that was all you were being taught coming from school, of a just say no kind of campaign era. I'm not surprised that I wasn't able to kind of fully engage with any other alternatives when that's all I really understood. So I think, as well as the SSDP chapters, places like Bristol University and their student services actually taking a harm reduction approach to drug policy is really helpful. And I think there's a huge part to play in education around the whole thing. I think in terms of like accessing or like working in this area, that it's difficult how opportunities crop up. That is just, there's not huge amounts of funding. I mean, you saw our team, there's not many of us, and I think it's kind of keeping an eye out. But I also think just like in your private life, participating in advocating for drug reform or whatever other thing is important. I think that's kind of what's led me to where I am today.
Thank you so much. Yeah, the SSDP, so the Students for Sensible Drug Policy, they do fantastic work around the UK, as do the drug science student societies as well. So yeah, if you do know any students or you are a student yourself, I would definitely second what Esther has said and do get in touch with them. And they are gathering momentum and much bigger than they were back in the day when I was at uni, that's for sure. Great, so I'd love to hear a bit more about the organisations you each work for, and I suppose what your hopes, visions are for the year ahead. Yeah, does that sound good? Yeah? Okay, let's start again with Elliot, if that's all right.
Right.
What have you got going on?
So we've got work on a sort of on the policy front and the lobbying on one side, and we've also got helping companies in the space on the regulatory side on the other. We've helped with a couple of guides for the industry. What does the government need to do to bring about change, say on the medical cannabis front or the CBD market? We would really love to get involved more on the psychedelics front from a policy perspective, and we have some plans in the work for that. And on the psychedelic medicine side, it's really about helping the companies that are struggling. And a lot of them don't just need legal advice; they need to be connected up to each other. Because everybody needs investment and financing to get things off the ground. It's very difficult for those, very sort of new and emerging companies to reach the very traditional funders. And we've been proved quite a helpful sort of connection point between the two. But other than that, it's really, just about getting the word about as much as we can and watching the industry grow.
Great. I think our top priority for the year ahead is to continue growing this network of participants. I think there's a very real situation that happens at the end of a clinical trial. Once the science is done, the participants are usually left feeling quite abandoned and with nowhere to go. People that don't understand the experience they've been through, particularly if it was their first time, they can't take these stories back to their families, their friends, and they feel like the only weirdo in the village. So our first aim is to actually find people that have been through this process and just connect with each other. There's sort of strength in being together, sharing our stories with each other. And then obviously, as I mentioned earlier, then taking those stories and those learnings that we can then use to then feed back on the process to people who are running these trials and designing these treatments. And that's really our second focus for the year, is doing that piece of work, closing that feedback loop, feeding back to people. And we've slowly started doing with that. We're hoping to make a bit of an impact in that space, and hoping there'll be many more opportunities for doing that. And the last and probably just as important thing is kind of what we're doing here tonight. We welcome the opportunity to speak about this work and to really find people and individuals and organizations that are in the space who are true allies that we can sort of work alongside. There's been lots of conversation about creating a movement. Well, we're here, we want to be part of the movement, we want to help shape the movement, and we want to keep talking about it loud and proud. So those are our aims for the year ahead.
So I'm conscious that we've talked a bit about clinical trials today and the quite small cohorts of patients or participants that can take part. So how big do you see your audience at the moment, and how are you getting the word out there either to institutions or indeed to people who have already participated on these trials?
So there've been a couple of third stage clinical trials which have larger pools of audiences. At the moment, we're still quite small, and obviously the earlier stages of the trials are quite small numbers, but that doesn't make it any less important to find those people and connect with them. How we're doing that is we're identifying organizations in the field and research institutions like Imperial. There was a list earlier on your presentation, Awaken, Beckley SciTech, really trying to get in there with these organizations. If you have links to anybody that you think we should be speaking to, please, pull Ian or I aside, because we're trying to get in at the earliest stage, because if you're going to give information to participants at the end, it needs to be part of the protocol, it needs to be signed off by ethics committees. So to make sure that we're passing information off to people that are, credible to be passed off to. So we're trying to get in not only with the current trials underway, but try to get in earlier for future trials, because I think there's a lot of work still to be done in this space.
Great, thank you. Okay, year ahead, what does it look like, Jade?
The year ahead, the CBD industry itself is currently under threat, and we're going through a regulation process which is called novel foods. The Food Standards Agency decided that because it wasn't deemed to have been consumed in great quantities before 1997, it was therefore novel and new and needed to go through a new regulatory process. And although I welcome regulation and I welcome quality, what it has done is put products like mine on a precipice of, oh, your products contain THC. Okay, that's on the Misuse of Drugs Act. THC is psychoactive. And EIHA, the European Industrial Hemp Association, are doing a world first study on 100 humans with CBD and THC to demonstrate that there is safety and that there is a limit as to what would be naturally occurring levels of THC that does not cause psychoactivity. In my opinion, whole plant is best. The cannabinoids work synergistically together and it's as nature intended, and that's how it should be consumed. So I've been working as a stakeholder, as an advisor to a number of different organisations, and I'm also a member of the all-party political group for CBD. And the intention is for us to try and contribute to the conversations that are happening with the Home Office and the FSA, because going back to Ryan's talk earlier about these 3 prescriptions that are out there for children, although we're not allowed to make medical claims, we do know that people benefit with medical issues from whole plant products. There's people out there that can't get prescriptions for their children. And the matter of fact is that over 1,000 of those families come to me to buy their products and get primary care advice and support from abroad. If the FSA and the Home Office go ahead and make us a tea-free industry, we've got the responsibility of over 1,000 families that are going to be deeply affected by the removal of the product, and there's no safeguards in place. And I'm committed and driven to make sure I do everything within my power to try and help those families, because I know what it feels like to be in that desperate state. So I see this year as get your A game on, because we've got a battle on our hands and we've got to prevail, and we've got to set Mother Nature free.
We've got so many wide-ranging things that we're doing. It's so hard to think about exactly what I should talk about, but I guess we're coming to the end of the year of the anniversary of the Misuse of Drugs Act, which will be in May this year.
I loved your campaign, by the way.
Thank you.
Really, really great creative. It's nice to see something that's not too clinical, not too pharmaceutical, and it was really fun and engaging.
Yeah, I've got to say,
that's the advertising hat on there.
With Drug Science Release, we had some great fun thinking about what we were going to make up. It was really good, and I think we've been thinking about the anniversary was a really great springboard to finally properly do a big splash with some sort of really useful, like you said, marketing around it to get policymakers on board with why we need a review. But actually, at the end of this campaign, the Misuse of Drugs Act will still be around. It still won't have been reviewed. So we will continue to be working on that and the continued engagement, both at a high political level, but also in local communities and focusing on kind of city level issues. And I think that is the kind of thing, is like that beginning of the movement bit, is just trying to get it happen on all the various strata and get everyone aligned on the same page. It's a really long pursuit, but I feel like this last year has really buoyed us to keep going rather than to just stop after a year. So that's kind of the UK. Oh, and we're also hoping that an overdose prevention centre will be open in Scotland.
Yes, please.
By the new year. Yeah. So
we need more safe drug consumption rooms, that's for sure.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I actually wanted to go back to Jade, because you mentioned, Esther's mentioned about marketing, and the campaign that Transform has done is fantastic. And I know that with Drug Science, we've been doing a paid campaign last year for Project 2021, because we can talk about the study that we're doing. But what kind of marketing issues have you come up against?
Well, before I answer that, I'll pre-answer a question you've not asked me, which was basically, I just want to mention Charlotte Figge. Charlotte Figge, if you don't know, is the namesake of the Charlotte's Web products. And Charlotte Figge's story, that weed documentary that I watched, Meeting the Stanley Brothers, that got people in Congress talking about policy change, because it was a heartfelt little girl whose life had completely changed. She was engaging, she was laid on the floor with a feeding tube just constantly in seizure. She was bouncing around in her ballet shoes. She was dancing. And that achieved more in a shorter space of time than research, than investment in research, because we are humans and we are emotionally connected to one another. And her story ignited America. There was a waiting list of 15,000 people the night after that show aired in America. And the brothers had to go and borrow money to grow more hemp, to get more. It was just a beautiful story. Sadly, we lost Charlotte at the beginning of COVID. And I made a promise to her mum that I would continue running forward with this, which brings me on to your question, which I can now answer, which is, it's really bloody hard. Because if you make a medical claim, you get a phone call, Jade, you're making medical claims and we're going to take your website down. I'm not, I'm just telling the truth. I'm telling you what happened to me. Facebook won't let you advertise because you've got a cannabis connotation, or you've got a, were you making a claim about this? So you've got to get really creative, and I quite enjoy a challenge. So, when you've got to think about, how do I say that this helps promote sleep without saying it helps promote sleep? You're going to feel amazing when you wake up in the morning. You've just got to really think about, how do I get this message across? But we really need an opportunity to educate consumers, because consumers don't know the full extent of what they're buying and what does good look like. But it is a distinct challenge, and it's one that continues, but you've just got to play the chess game and try and outbeat them every time.
Absolutely. I know that at Drug Science, we've had to work with someone who actually used to work at Facebook, and even with someone who used to work at Facebook, working with Facebook is near on impossible, and there are many hoops to jump through, but we're kind of all, it feels like, edging closer and sharing our knowledge with one another, which is great. I wonder, Elliot, if you can speak to any of the kind of advertising laws, and whether you think that that we can be coming at it from the work that you do as well, working with the advertising regulations to make things easier for us all.
Yeah, actually, you made a really good point. We started looking at a lot of these claims in the first 2018. People would bring CBD products to market, and exactly as you say, you can't say treats anxiety. You say promotes calm, you can't, and once everybody works that formula out, it kind of is a bit silly, right? Because yeah, you get that mainly in the what we call the unregulated product space. We have a lot of clients asking us, can we get our Amazon advertising back? Can we get our Facebook advertising back? Because they will just put up a blanket ban because you said the naughty word, and cannabis, psychedelics, and in fact, even when we were looking to start the department, we wanted to call it the psychedelic medicines department, but even that word at the time was too woo-woo. So we had to go with, do we go neurochemical? Do we go psychoactive? And we got away with that. But and that was a very wide consultation. I spoke to people in the industry and obviously internally, externally. So yeah, we've got a task on our hands. We do.
Yeah, and again, reinforces. Yes, of course, Tara. Microphone, all yours.
One of the challenges we've had, because obviously I put up there like a fake, well, dream ad, right? And it was for the conference that's happening on the 11th of May, because there's nothing that says I can't legally advertise my campaign, right? But the media owners won't do it. And that, as far as I'm concerned, is fucking censorship. But then I went to them, and there was much conversation about this. And then I went to them, basically said, well, there's a legal event happening at the National Frigging Gallery. Will you let me advertise that? And then they were like, yeah, we probably should let you advertise that, shouldn't we? And there's an MP speaking and all these other. And so, you know, one of the things we've been looking at is actually, you know, if they won't let us frigging advertise anything in Out of Home, how do I advertise this event? Not because I want, again, not because, well, you do want to sell tickets when it's fab, but actually just for people to be seeing this in the real world again around them. And I think there are sort of Trojan techniques and tactics that we as a movement may need to employ, not just to get around the actual legislation, but to get again around the stigma that other parties involved are subject to.
I'll tell you who did get some Out of Home in Peckham, which is where I live, and that is John Hopkins and his Music for Psychedelic Therapy album. What an amazing thing to do. It's the name of his album that he created for a psychedelic experience or inspired by, and he managed to do an Out of Home, a billboard campaign for the album, which was called Music for Psychedelic Therapy. So he did an amazing job for us all there, I think, in that campaign. So I'm going to move on to maybe talking about some key challenges that we've all come up against, and you've already spoken a bit about yours there, Jade. I wonder, Leonie, if you could speak about some key things that you've faced in your journey to where you are now and in the creation of PsyPan as well.
So we had our first challenge right on the starting block. We were trying to register PsyPan as an organization with Companies House, and it was rejected because it had the word psychedelic. We don't deal in psychedelics, we don't administer psychedelics, there we just have the word psychedelic, and it was rejected. So after some long conversations and some probably education in the process, it had the word psychedelic, and it's red flagged it. So then you have to say, I'm just yeah, it was definitely an education process. We then pointed out that there were other organizations who were advocacy related, not dealing with the substance itself. Exactly. I mean, this is the level of the stigma we're facing. I mean, it's really easy, or sometimes easy to forget that outside of a room like this, that's the reality we still face. There are pockets of brilliance, and this is definitely one of them. But outside of the room, it still remains a massive barrier. I think for me personally, what I do is I try to talk about psychedelics wherever I can. I try bring it up. I think we need to, I mean, Jade made a fantastic point about how we humans, we need to connect. So I welcome every opportunity to talk about my experiences, to connect with people. And when I get pulled back at the side gates by two mums who just have a couple of questions for me, and they're not looking at me as if I'm a threat to life and their children's well-being, but actually that I may have something really good to share and some advice that could really transform their lives, then I think that's how we win hearts and minds, and that's how we sort of change the stigma around all of this.
How has it been talking to your close friends and family about your experiences? I know it's been a couple of years now. How's that journey been?
I think it was a bit easier around the psilocybin experience, because I think a lot of people have probably nibbled on a mushroom. They probably have some sort of frame of reference around what psychedelic or what psilocybin or magic mushrooms are like. I think I'm definitely hitting a bit of a wall and a blank stare when I try to talk about my DMT experiences. They don't call it the spirit molecule for nothing. And you really do need to really try experience it to really experience it. It's one of those things that, I don't know, it's like, dancing about architecture. There's no relationship. Words do not do it justice. And so trying to come back with an experience like that, which from my experience took me back to sort of pre-verbal places, if not childbirth, and a sort of rebirthing experience, you know, you come across sounding a little bit crazy talking about that. And what's fascinating about it is the impact it's had on me, because, you know, 20 years of therapy and talking about things I can only remember without really tapping into that really visceral sense of a lack of safety, a lack of being held, a lack of being attuned to or noticed as a new human. And really, and then seeing from that point on, then all of a sudden the experiences in your early childhood and your formative years start making sense, and you can see where it all started. But actually, you know, how do you talk? Here I am talking about it, but how do you talk about this stuff? Why, thank you.
That's why we have her here today. Leonie's fantastic, isn't she? Thank you so much. I suppose one more question for me, I think, before we put it out to our audience. Obviously, we've seen the cannabis industry grow rapidly over recent years, and now we're seeing vast amounts of money being injected into psychedelic startups. Everyone kind of getting in there, getting ready for hopefully the rescheduling that hopefully will occur, not sure when, but hopefully very soon. What potential dangers do you see in the advent of big money into the psychedelic scene? I suppose relating to that, what can we be learning from the cannabis industry as well? I wonder, Esther, have you got any thoughts on that? Or I can move to Jade. Or...
Yeah, I guess I can start. I mean, as what I said in my talk is there, and I know that you spoke about this in your thing, that money does need to be in it for change to happen and for this to become more in the mainstream. However, we really do, and it's not just the cannabis industries, it's the tobacco and alcohol, which I think we take for granted how much they have kind of put their fingers into government decisions around policy over the last 50, 60 years. And I think we need to be definitely very cautious to not pursue with too much glee something at the cost of opportunity for social equity and justice to be installed. And, you know, the reality is that corporations are there to make money. That's why they're corporations. So we need to be careful that they do not then influence the regulation of psychedelics simply for that, and make sure that those who that it's not led by those with most social capital to begin with. Essentially, we mustn't forget the indigenous use, mustn't forget marginalized use. And I also think that just recreational, non-medical use, the people who just take mushrooms at the weekend, it can't just be framed as a wellness thing necessarily. I don't think we need to be careful to not forget about different user motivations and those people as we move on. Yeah.
I think from my experience with the cannabis industry and looking at what happened in the States, and we're about 8 to 10 years behind America, it feels. But what happened, say, like in 2016, when I set up Savage Cabbage, and it was like, this is going to be the next big thing. And there's all these people arrived and all this money arrived and there was all sorts of activity. And it was like, we haven't even got a bloody industry yet. What are you doing? Calm down. And there was this like rush to kind of produce things. And in my personal opinion, a lot of corners were potentially cut and quality wasn't key. And it wasn't really a matter of, I really care what's in this bottle that this person's going to buy because I really want them to thrive and be a good human and just feel amazing. It was get something in there, sell it, quids in. What I don't want to see is that happen again. And it's interesting because we've kind of come a bit full circle, because the people who thought they were going to make the money quickly, they're not here anymore because they didn't make money quickly and they've jumped onto the next thing. People like me are still here. You know, we're still fighting for the plant. We're still fighting for what we think is right. And I don't want to see quality suffer just because people have got connections on networks and they can get this passed and they get the deal and you can buy that and it's shit. Sorry.
About talking about people jumping onto the next thing, it's been noted, especially in Canada and the cannabis corporate capture there, where there are dormant mining companies that lie, and then they set themselves up in other countries where they think legal regulation is about to happen and snap up into action as soon as that process is instigated. So I think you do need to be cynical and really wary of what these organizations are doing.
Thank you. Conscious of time, I'd like to put it out to the audience. We've got a not so roaming mic, but a mic here that can be passed around for anyone who'd like has got some questions. Thank you, Callie. It's very bright up here, isn't it?
Thank you. Hello. It's the same question from before, but I'll go into a little bit more detail. It's a bit more detail because there's a lawyer there. And so I've studied the European Convention on Human Rights somewhat. I did a short course on it. And we're all signed up to it as signatories. There's 20 or so other countries in Europe all signed up, and it has to, and under the Human Rights Act, which came into power in 2000, all laws and policies have to be consistent with the Human Rights Act and the protected rights and freedoms. So for the past 20 years, we've had drug prohibition, which directly, massively, extremely, unfucking believably, massively violates our rights, right? It interferes, and the interference is a violation because there's unjustifiable. It's not necessary for the protection of anything. So to my mind, I would like to, we're all victims of prohibition. Every single person under the jurisdiction of the UK government is a victim because we are not allowed to have access to our own neurons. It's fucking crazy. So there's no greater invasion of our privacy, and that's protected right. So I would like to take the take the British government and their drug policies for a judicial review by the Supreme Court. Now, as I understand it, it needs to exhaust remedies, domestic remedies. They're immediately exhausted. What's her face? Priti Patel, can I use any drug I choose and have access to it, please? No, you fucking can't. Thank you, I'm going to the Supreme Court. What's wrong with my reasoning? Why can't we just get the Supreme Court to make a declaration of incompatibility, and then we don't have to talk to politicians because they've got an excuse to make the changes that they're too scared to make? Okay. That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a really good question, and it's tricky because and I'll preface this by saying I'm not a human rights lawyer, specifically constitutional administrative law, so there will be people with slightly more acute answers, but states annoyingly are allowed to interfere with your human rights as long as it is on proportionate grounds. And this goes back to convincing the governments whether it is proportionate to interfere with your rights, and at the moment they seem to believe it is. They seem to believe, prohibiting drug use is a credible reason, a legitimate reason to do that. You could bring a claim. You could. Funding would be enormous, and you'd have to get, a lot. But I think what would happen, we get another circular argument would come around, and they just say, it's a legitimate reason to keep these rules in place. Why don't you put it through the 10-year, clinical trial process, spend lots of money, and then we'll prove it's not safe, and we end up in the same silly loop? So it's a very good question.
The fact that it's not safe is why it needs to be legalized and regulated.
The judicial reviews are very, very expensive, very time-consuming process. They don't necessarily.
Judicial reviews are very expensive, very time-consuming processes, and the outcomes aren't going to be necessarily ones that are going to be in your favor. You're not asking the Supreme Court to make a decision based on fairness. You're asking them to review a decision they've already made. So in their mind, it could be that, at the moment they don't feel it's right to make the decision that you want. So it might be a lot of money wasted down the drain. So in terms of building the evidence profile, like we were saying before, showing safety seems like more of a legitimate route to having these regulations changed, as opposed to a bit more of a brute force human rights claim, even though I'm not saying that's not a potential route. And I definitely feel for what you're saying. It's just we have to take into account about what the outcome of a judicial review will be and how that might affect how these compounds are treated in the future.
You think it could be worse than it is now?
Well, if you're asking the Supreme Court to make a decision on something they've already made a decision on.
But they have, here's the thing, sorry.
Come and talk to us. We'll run it with you if we can. We will go.
Sorry, folks.
No, we appreciate your passion and enthusiasm. We're with you on it. Okay, I'm going to move on to a question from one of our Zoom watchers. They've asked a question for Leonie, asking, how does one get to participate in the clinical trials?
So the way I Googled and I found out that there were certain institutions running trials. At that point, it was Imperial, and it's a process of applying. And I think part of our work as PsyPan is to support people even during the application process, because that in itself can be pretty harrowing. Okay, yeah, so Imperial's closed. Hammersmith Medicine's research are currently recruiting for their DMT and their psilocybin trials. So it's a matter of just keeping an eye on the organizations that are running the trials and then applying.
Ibogaine as well.
Yeah. But I think it's really important to be sort of kind of realistic in terms of what the process is like. I think they screened over 4,000 people before the first 5 were accepted onto the DMT trial. I know a number of participants in our network who were accepted into previous trials who were screened out of the current trials that are underway. And that from a safeguarding point of view, puts people in extraordinarily difficult situations, because you're left either then with needlessly suffering and knowing that there's a treatment that helps you and not being able to re-access it again, even though you had access in the past. In fact, one participant just said to me that it might have been better prior to the first trial, because then you thought there was nothing that could touch the science, nothing would ever help. But now you know that there is something and you just can't get it. And I do wonder if that lends a case for what kind of compassionate access do we maybe offer participants who have been through the trial process while we changing these long systems. You've given somebody a carrot, you've given somebody that hope, and then you dash it. That can't be right.
And what is the current compassionate framework?
There isn't. So I'm starting to think as PsyPan, what are we doing for people that have been through it? They've contributed body, heart, mind, and soul to the scientific process, and then they're left. So there might be something around there.
And actually, on that note, at one of the recent members' socials, I met someone who had taken part in the Imperial anorexia study with psilocybin, and she felt that she'd been kind of left, I suppose, and to fend for herself after having two doses, so 2 incredible experiences. And we pointed her in the direction of our society integration circles and also the Maudsley Foundation integration circles as well. So if you are seeking psychedelic integration support, those are 2 circles that we would highly recommend as a society. I can see.
Could I add a third one to that?
Yes.
One that's really been instrumental, and probably even more so than the psilocybin experience, was working with Ros Watts and her Acer connectedness program, which will be launching on the 6th of May. 6th of May. It's the Acer integration program. And perfect. What's amazing about the program, you spoke about it earlier, it really focuses on that connectedness, that interconnection, the mycelial network, and it really plugs you into a community of people. For me, the risk is not that money's flooding into the sector, but that all of a sudden we'll have these people with nowhere to go, where their experience can be held, where they can continue with their integration work and really embed their learning. So we don't have the therapists to support it, we don't have the containers to hold it. So for me, that's where the risk is.
Thank you. And yeah, we are actually helping host an event with Ros Watts next month, as we say. So please check out the Dandelion website if you're interested in getting a ticket for that. Ryan.
Hopkins.
Sorry?
And John Hopkins.
And John Hopkins, right. And he will be there. Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah, it's just about recruitment for studies. So Imperial are recruiting at the moment for chronic pain, OCD, and anorexia nervosa. So if anyone does have those conditions, you can come to our website and inquire. So yeah, we're recruiting for that, but not for depression anymore. But I think Compass Pathway is doing their phase 3 through King's College. So that's another option as well.
Thank you, Ryan. So there was another question, a hand up over here, this way. Sorry, Carla, you're making you run around the room. Do you know, while you're doing that, I'll ask a question from Zoom. It's to Jade. This person asks, they ask a quick question. What is your experience with drugs? And you can choose how you'd like to answer that one.
Well, my dress is more exciting than my life. So I was one of those people who was drugs are bad, okay, and I saw a lot of people around me use drugs, get into trouble with drugs, develop addictive behaviours and have real catastrophic experiences. And I was really boring. So when my husband asked me to use cannabis oil, hemp oil. My first response was no. I tried it once and I vomited everywhere. Thanks, but no thanks. So I was very much against it. So my experience has been quite rapidly introduced to something that's quite different. Do I think that drugs should be on a Misuse of Drugs Act? I think people should have the right to access what they want to access. And it's not a nanny state, and we're adults and we know what we need to do. And I think money should be put into helping people recover from trauma, because drugs are used as a self-soothe, and then people are looked down upon for having addictions.
Yeah. Go to your question.
Hi, thanks for your time and for your talks. They're all really great. My question's mainly for Esther, and I think a little bit for Elliot as well. Is it safe to say that you would consider yourself on the left politically? Yeah. Me too. And I would go out on a limb and say that it's safe to say that most people in the room would feel the same, right? But I'm interested. So I thought that was a safe bet, right? But I'm interested, Esther, if I understand correctly, a lot of your job involves talking to the other side of the aisle. How do you find that? I mean, I could go a bit more into my motivation for asking that question, but I'm really interested in, there's a certain balance to be struck, right? Where you have to put your personal views to one side to try and get stuff done. So I'm interested both like how do you do that? And also how does it impact on you? How do you feel?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think my motivation to actually get change done in drug policy also makes me realize that regardless of whatever your political leanings are, if you are sort of understanding that what currently we have isn't working, then we have the same goal and we can work towards it together. It's definitely harder to engage. And actually, I don't think it is necessarily a left-right all the time. I think you might think that, but actually drug policy is way more complicated. And where you think that perhaps Labour may have an excellent policy at the moment, then they're not. They're doubling down on tough on crime, criminal enforcement, and reducing drug use through that way. And absolutely. Sorry, I don't think that's what I'm suddenly trying to. Okay. I think a lot of the time in this discourse, the police, whereas there's a police officer, ex-police officer in the room and just done definitely. Yeah, and actually I think it's I have, so it's like, yeah. And I think that's it. And actually that it demonstrates that drug policy affects everyone in society in different ways, whether it be professional or personal, and that has nothing to do with political leaning. And for me, I will, if we may disagree on other things, we don't discuss them. This is my job. My job is to talk about drug policy and how can we get to the same point together. And that's my main priority.
Great. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Another question that we had from Zoom was around regulations in the UK for drug trials in PTSD. The question was asking that the person who asked the question said that there are regulations around depression, but not around PTSD, as far as we're aware. I don't know if either of you two can speak to that, or maybe Ryan, about regulations in PTSD trials. Yes, yeah. Let's talk. Can you talk to that? We need to give you like.
Hi, so for all psychedelic trials, MDMA trials, and any kind of clinical trial, there's always eligibility criteria. The main ones at the moment that we have are based on if you have any family relatives with schizophrenia or psychotic episodes in the past, because there's not enough research out there at the moment to know whether that's safe to give them to participants. Every clinical trial has its own specific criteria, but I think the main one is psychiatric screening. Also comorbidity. So a lot of the time, a lot of individuals in the real world have more than one diagnosis, and that's just the way that mental health works. I mean, I agree, but in the context of controlled clinical research, and why it's not always the best option, is that you have to have these very defined conditions which are not representative of the national sample, and that's just a problem with clinical trials generally. But yeah, so trial participation is sometimes very limited, but that's just unfortunate. And we're working on ways that drug science come around that, and I think regulators are looking into it a bit more now.
Yeah, and I should add to that as well, drug science on our medical cannabis study, Project 2021, one of the primary conditions that we do analysis on is PTSD, and that is a real world evidence study, not a trial. And so we're able to have patients on there who have comorbidities. So a patient might have depression and anxiety and PTSD, and we're not restricting our pool. You know, we're able to welcome in so many more people onto the study, so many more people can access the medicine that way. And it's unfortunate that, of course, the nature of randomized controlled trials, as Ryan said, is that they end up being very, very restrictive and very, very expensive as well. Fantastic. Okay, what time are we on? 5 more minutes. Okay. Right. Another gorgeous question we had off of our Zoom audience as well, which I just think is a wonderful one to start drawing us to a close, is we're asking our panelists to paint a picture of a world in which drugs are regulated, the public is educated in their benefits, and there is fully integrated, and this is fully integrated into our culture. Please paint me this picture, Elliot.
I've got to be very careful here because there's a lot of, obviously, the authorities that think that's sort of in its view at the moment. Okay, so as a thought experiment, imagine you go down to Boots the chemist and they give you a package which has got lots of information on, and it talks about the dosage and it talks about where the products come from, and it has been produced cleanly. I remember we did some work with what are called wholesale dealers in this country for medicines, and these are the gentlemen who are and the ladies who are responsible for transporting medicines. And the level of controls that you have to put on those just to get them from A to B are so strict. Humidity controls, temperature controls, pest control, everything. And if you think of the difference between street, quantities and pharmaceutical grade, we've even heard the researchers say that clinical grade MDMA, for example, is nothing like street MDMA. So just imagine you go to Boots and you get something that you have absolutely no risk. It's got full information, and you didn't have to on the illegal market.
Wow, what a world that would be. Jade.
I think for me, one thing that really narks me, and it's a survey that's been recently done on Twitter, is what's sort of socially acceptable if you're wealthy and not if you're poor. Tattoos, using cannabis, using drugs, having an addiction, all those things are, what I would like to see is that we're all treated quite fairly, and if everybody's got fair access, that it would go some way to creating less of a financial divide, which would then in turn make us kinder to one another. And actually look out for those that are less than, or more, that's a really bad term, you know what I mean, financially worse off. It's been a long day, sorry. But just to have that sense of community, sense of care, sense of just giving a shit. It's not a difficult thing to do, but you see it, if you've got enough money, you can go and get yourself a medical cannabis prescription and be a legal medical cannabis user. But how does a sniffer dog differentiate between the person who's got a prescription and the person who got it from the guy around the corner? They can't. We need some equality, and I think that's what I'd like to see.
Yeah, I like that. I have many parts to this vision. I could write a book. I probably would start with all criminal. I would start with all criminal records for drug possession to be completely removed from everyone's record, because you're now living in a legal regulated society and you should not be having to pay for prohibitionist approaches and having your life opportunities ruined. And then I also have a similar vision of a dedicated pharmacy style outlet, probably not Boots, because what I'm talking about is non-medical use. So we don't need to necessarily confuse those things. There you go. where you can have access to a trained professional who knows what they're talking about. They talk you through how much you should use, what are you used to, what the side effects may be. They hand over a specific amount. You know where it's come from. It is safe. It is ethical. I think that is the other thing. I know the government always puts this whole thing, all these horrible tropes on, well, why are we participating in this market? It's so unethical. We're not given any other option. And actually, it would be so important to make sure that it's not just at the point of purchase that you've got safe supply, but that it is stemming all the way back to those producer countries where all these people who are marginalized are participating in an illegal trade and putting their lives on the line for it. So this would be an opportunity for those people to also improve their life circumstances. And then you'd buy a small vial of cocaine powder.
Wow, what a world. Okay, to close us off then, thank you. I would like us to each share one way in which those of us here today could help move you closer to your mission. And I think we're all united in our collective mission of fairer, evidence-based drug policy for the UK. But one way in which people here today can do something to help.
Yeah, I think, again, it goes back to offering whatever skills you have. It will be different for everybody. You know, if you have skills in the administration or marketing, whatever it is, lend up those skills and just sort of, you know, do whatever you can personally, because it'll be very different for everybody, I think.
Yeah, we as PsyPan, we certainly can use some of those skills. So if anybody wants to support our work, come help us. But I think for me, the important thing is to keep having those open, honest conversations. I think prohibition has shut down those connections between people, those open, honest connections. And I think as the nature of psychedelics is just to connect to each other and to the environment. And not only will we save the rainforests from organized crime, but we will save the planet for ourselves.
I think for me, it's something I say quite a lot, and it sounds really cheesy, but it's really true. But kindness is contagious, and we just need to share these stories, have conversations with people you might not necessarily speak to, and share these stories. And stories and people coming together and community building is a uniting thing. And I think community is key to the success of a revolution. And I think beginning to see something that's forming, and I would like to see the momentum. So kindness is contagious, and just be nice.
I have a very practical call for you to come and join our lobby of Parliament on the, now I can't remember whether it's the 27th or 28th of June, whichever is the Tuesday.
It's on your website.
It's on our website. It's on the Anyone's Child website, anyone'schild.org. And we will be coming together with our Anyone's Child families and activists to lobby MPs and get them out and talk to them and make them talk to us about drug reform. So please join us then.
Thank you. And one from me, which is really my personal story, have a think about what your skill is or what your skill set is, because you don't have to work in Parliament, you don't have to be a doctor, you don't have to be a scientist to get into this world. Every single one of you has skills that are useful and that can be of use to all of our organisations. So think about what those are, come and talk to us, send us an email. We'd love to hear from you. I'd like to thank all of our speakers here today. Thank you to Elliot, Leonie, and Esther and Jade. It's been a wonderful day. Thank you very much.